today we're going to talk about writing a scientific research paper. And keep in mind, it can be also informative for writing a scientific research proposal as well. But when you write a proposal, you're only going to be doing the introduction and method section. You will not be writing the results or the discussion. But in general, all scientific research papers follow this, like I said, very general or typical format. We have an introduction section, a method section, a results section, a discussion and or conclusion section, and a references section. Now the introduction section is going to do just that. It's going to introduce the reader to the topic, and then it's often going to be backed up by previous research. We're all going to introduce the scope of the problem. We're going to also introduce the hypothesis for this specific research and give a literature review. So this is all going to come together to sort of lay a foundation so that the reader understands what it is you're interested in, what it is you're studying, why you're studying it, what you know about it, kind of taking the reader on the journey that you were on as to how and why you came to ask this research question. Let's look at an example. So this was an introduction section done regarding the problem of electronic waste. I'm going to read this kind of quickly, but let's just take a look at this. E-waste is a solid waste that is generated by households and corporations from used electronic items, including computers, televisions, printers, cell phones, personal digital assistants, entertainment equipment, and other forms of communication devices. Electronic waste poses a global predicament because several countries lack infrastructures for recovery and recycling of used electronics. There are no adequate international regulations to mandate proper disposal, transportation, or recycling of e-waste. E-waste is potentially hazardous, cumbersome, and unresolved form of solid waste worldwide. In 2005, e-waste was considered the fastest growing form of solid waste in the industrialized world, increasing approximately 4% annually. And e-waste is also an under-researched problem. The process involved with the end-of-life electronic products are under-monitored and under-regulated, both local and global scales. Now, you have your choice. We can either continue on with the e-waste lecture or we can go on with our research paper lecture. I'm kidding. We're going to stick with the research paper. But when you look at this, you can sort of see there's a little bit of a description about it, just in general, what e-waste is. So it's identified here. It's also, goes on to talk about the problem at hand, that it is the fastest growing form worldwide. It's backed up by literature. You can see a lot of people that agree that it's hazardous, it's cumbersome, it's unresolved, it's fast growing. So you see here in the introduction how the scope of the problem is getting generally laid out. Eventually, in the next paragraph or two of this paper, the hypothesis is introduced as well, and the research question. After the hypothesis, the research question, the general scope and background of a problem, and the field and topic, you're going to want to have a literature review. And this is in the introduction section. And a literature review is a review of previous literature, typically scholarly literature. Sometimes there's a couple of news articles, or it depends upon what topic you're studying as to what forms of literature. But often in scientific papers, it's going to be scholarly or peer-reviewed literature. And you want to look and search for everything in the topic that you're studying, in the topic that you're working on. And this lets the reader know that A, it gives them more background to what's going on, but it also lets them know that where you're coming from and what you've learned and why you feel your research is important and how this fits in with the research that's already there in the body of science. So what we do is we gather the papers that we feel are important for the literature review, and with each of those we want to talk about who did the study, what did they do, how did they do it, what were their results, and what were their limitations. As you're doing this, a few good websites that you might want to use are OWL at Purdue. This is going to help you with both citing your citations in the paper and your references. There's also Son of a Citation Machine that helps with references. Zotero is a great free to use source that collects and gathers your, it's a citation, what am I trying to say? It's a citation program. So you can keep things, you can keep your sources on that, and it's very handy and currently is free. Let's look at a literature review. So continuing with our e-waste example, if you look at this kind of second paragraph, so the first paragraph just talks about like potential health effects from toxic metals found in e-waste villages can be validated. So this is just kind of introducing this area of the literature review where they're going to talk about health problems from metals. And then we can jump in. Hu et al. Studied a sample population of 226 children under 6 years old for blood lead levels. Of the sample population, 165 children lived in one of 4 towns that practiced artisanal e-waste recycling within Guayu, China. The other 61 children resided in the neighboring town of Shendian, which is mostly textile industries and not e-waste. Blood and hemoglobin samples indicated that Guayu children had significantly higher blood lead levels than Shendian children. Of the children tested in Guayu, 81% had blood lead levels above 10 deciliters or 10 micrograms per deciliter. Results allowed Hu et al. To conclude that there is a positive correlation between blood lead levels and exposure to e-waste in artisanal recycling area. Zhang et al. So now we've gone on to another article. So this is one right here. This is one recap of one peer-reviewed journal article. This team of researchers studied, we talk about who they studied, how they studied them, what they did, how they did it, who they used, what their results were. If there were any limitations, it would be in here. But basically, in this one paragraph, we've captured those critical questions about a study, an entire study that probably took place for a year. So as a literature review, you want to capture this on everything you've learned. You can see the next paragraph goes right into a different article. Zhang et al. Compared blood lead levels and blood cadmium levels for 154 children less than 8 years old who lived in one of the 3 recycling villages in Guayu, and etc. I don't need to keep reading. But this is what a literature review is. It's just article after article after article, and you're giving that critical information. I can go back. Who did the study? What did they do? How did they do it? What were their results or conclusions, and did they have any limitations? And you just want to keep doing this. It's a formula, and it's a very important formula. And this will give the reader the background, the same background that you have. So you're kind of bringing them up to speed on what you know about the field that you're practicing. After we've finished the introduction and the literature review section, which is part of the introduction, we want to go into the method section. The method section will explain in very specific details how you plan to do your study or how you did your study. So if you're writing a proposal, you're gonna put in here how you intend to do your study. If you've already done it, you're gonna write how you did your study if you're writing a full paper, if you've done an entire study. You want to talk about what instrumentation you used. You want to talk about how you gathered your data. This could include surveys, observations, experiments, archive data, whatever it is that you used, secondary data. You want to talk about whatever it is you've used. You also want to be able to justify why you chose to do what you did. So you want to be in absolute detail, and you want to sometimes explain why you've done that. Basically, you want to always be telling the readers the how, the when, the where, the why, and the who that you worked with. So you want to think of writing a method section very similar to that of writing a recipe card. You want to include every single thing you've done, how you've done it, who you've done it with, so that somebody can then come along maybe a year later, 10 years later, they can mimic or copy your study. We want people to copy our research and hopefully get the same results. This will strengthen and validate what it is that we did. There are some common subsections that you're going to find in a method section when you're writing it, or even when you're reading it. But when you're writing one, you're going to include the participants that were used in the study, the design of the study, any of the specific procedures that you had during the study, some of the materials that you would use in the study, and of course every study is different. So there of course could be very research specific sections. Maybe you're looking at different locations or a specific behavior, something like that. That would also, you can create your own section. But the others are just common. We see these, it's a great starting place. And if you did not have any participants maybe, then you wouldn't need it. You don't have to have these. This is just it's a great starting place. But you want to be very, very specific. So when I think about writing a recipe, and I think about maybe I went to some sort of family dinner and I brought like this just absolutely killer, potato salad. I might have my sisters ask me, oh, gee, that's great. Can I have your recipe? And it's very possible that I would possibly hold something back so that, if both of us showed up with the potato salad at another family dinner, mine would still be the better one, right? You guys get this, right? I have a lot of siblings, so sometimes we can get a little competitive. But when you're doing science, you definitely don't want to do that. You want to be as transparent, as clear with your directions, with what you did, so that somebody can copy you. Getting copied and having someone turn up with your results is an amazing and great thing in science. It strengthens and validates the work you did. So you always want to keep that in mind. You want people to know exactly how to do what you did. You can see starting here, it talks about the type of heat furnace that was used in detail. Porcelain crucible was used to hold shredded samples weighing between 10 and 15 grams, etc., etc., etc. It's very mundane, it's very detailed, it's very not exciting. But a method section is really important. We can see in the second paragraph that in order to replicate outdoor burning temperatures, the furnace was preheated to 799 degrees. This temperature was chosen to match previous studies, such as Stewart and Lemieux, who incinerated So again, we're talking about why we chose that. We're talking about exactly what we did, why we did it, who did it before. You feel free to pause and you can read this on your own, but I'll go ahead and move forward. But this is a good example of a method section. And after the method section, you move into the results section. Now the results section is where, that's right, you guessed it, the results are going to go. So we want to put things in our written words, our statistical results, our graphs and charts, but we don't necessarily want to talk about what all the results mean. That we're going to save for the discussion or the conclusion. In the results section, as silly as it sounds, we just want the results. They should be very clear, they should be concise. They should be important enough to put in the paper. Sometimes we get a lot of results, but not all of them are important to the reader, and not all of them have value or meaning that's useful enough to include in our report. So you can have a slight preliminary discussion of results, but usually the majority of them are going to be, the discussion will follow in the discussion section. So let's look at a results section. Here's a results section that's just literally giving results. The laboratory analysis identified that cobalt had 197,000 micrograms per kilogram and 208,000 micrograms per kilogram. Nickel had, and it's just, you can see this is just going to continue and continue about what we saw. We saw some different metals. Over here we have what? Beryllium, mercury, molybdenum. I can never say that word. And this is just going to tell us what our results are. And there are actually a few pages of this. So not a lot of discussion about what it means yet. We're kind of saving that. We're saving that for our discussion section. The discussion section is where we want to discuss what the results mean. We want to interpret these findings. What does that mean when I found more nickel than, I didn't remember the chart from before, thallium? What does that mean? What do I think? We want to evaluate then back to our hypothesis. At some point in time early on in the introduction, we hypothesized what we thought we would see. Now we know what we've seen. So we're going to tie it back. Is this something, do we agree with the hypothesis? Are we going to reject the null hypothesis? We want to discuss all of this. We want to discuss things that we hadn't anticipated finding. Sometimes you're doing something, you're measuring for A, and the next thing you know, B is really like all of a sudden showing up, and you think, oh my gosh, I didn't even consider that would be an issue. So that's when you want to discuss that as well. We want to connect what's happened to what we thought we would see. We also want to connect it to what's been seen in previous literature. So you start to kind of tie everything back together. You start to wrap it up. We can compare the results that we got to what some of the previous literature got for their results. This is also in the discussion section where we want to discuss any limitations that we had or that you had. We want to discuss if in the middle of the experiment, maybe a pandemic arose and we had to change timing for something. There are things that happen in the world that can cause a limitation. There can also be limitations that we hadn't anticipated just with our design, because it was somehow it turned into summertime and it was always too hot out, so people were more irritable or something like that. You don't quite know sometimes until you get into the middle of it. But you want to be very transparent with your limitations. Oftentimes those limitations are what's going to sort of inform future scientists or future researchers. This is maybe the next step. Maybe a limitation was that we hadn't considered an elderly population to be part of this study, and we realize that's a limitation, and future research should actually look at the elder population for the same study. Things like that. So we also find out through our limitations what's a good place for the future research to go. And this is also kind of a long, sorry, some of these slides are just a lot of words, but we can see here, this research has presented evidence of the negative public health impacts from dismantling and incineration practices that are currently used in cottage villages for artisanal e-waste recycling. E-waste that is incinerated as trash and not for purposes of artisanal recycling also poses a health risk of toxic exposures to the populations living and working near them. Blah, blah, blah. Trash burning sites. These populations are at risk for exposure to metals, dioxins and furans, PHAs, semi-volatile organic compounds, and PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers. So this goes on and on. Down here we talk about some of the risks, some of the health problems that you see: upper respiratory difficulties, eye irritations, liver and kidney disease, gastrointestinal disturbances, nausea. Boy, this does not sound like fun. Anyway, so we're starting to tie it back into some of the things that we had in the literature review. We're talking about the metals. The literature review was actually like 20 pages long, but we tie it back into metal exposures, public health risks, some of the health problems that we're seeing, some of the evidence that we saw from the results section. And that is what we want to do in a discussion section, kind of tie it all back together. So again, just to recap, for a scientific research paper, you're going to have an introduction, a method section, a results section, a discussion and or conclusion, and a reference section. If you're doing just if you're doing a proposal for your research, you're going to still write an introduction, which includes the literature review and a method section. And that is about it. As I said, we're going to break these down further one by one as we go forward with our proposal papers. Have a great day. Bye-bye.